for context, we started the business in earnest in 21. And when my co-founder and I were sort of kicking around ideas for this, we were seeing a couple of key trends occurring in broader multifamily. The first was consolidation in the space, meaning there were companies either acquiring the assets of other companies or acquiring the whole company, and you were seeing a larger number of units managed by a smaller number of companies. What this effectively meant was that there were these networks forming, right? One company with 50,000, 100,000, or a million apartment units, but these networks were really only sort of legal or physical networks. They weren't technological networks, and they certainly didn't look to the resident as a network. They sort of thought about their apartment as the four walls they lived in. They didn't think of it as this broader expanse of everything that sat under this brand. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that renters were sort of renting for longer, and that both of these things have continued to be trends since we started the business. To put some numbers on that, around the financial crisis in 07, 08, average renters renting for maybe 7-8 years. Today, that number has more than doubled, right? The NAR, the National Association of Realtors, put out the average or median home buyer price last year was 40 years old. So you can sort of think of that as if you're renting from 2022 to 40, right? So it's a longer journey, a lot more life changes, a lot more going on. And then the third is sort of a mixture of things around technology, which is we felt like the second wave of sort of technology in the multifamily space was in place. Like there was some good foundational pieces around like operational work, but nobody was really leaning in yet. And it felt like people were starting to lean into this idea that you could use software to actually change your strategy. And we said, okay, you've got these bigger networks, you've got people renting for longer, you've got consumer expectations sort of evolving and adapting, and you've got this platform of technology foundation upon which you can build. Holy cow, there's a real opportunity here to put all that together and say, how do you create a more continuous renter journey, right? Like that's sort of like a noble thing to think about for the renter, but also for the real estate operator, it meant in business terms, how do you change the CAC to LTV equation, the acquisition cost to lifetime value equation? Average renter is staying in the same place for maybe 1.5 to 2 years, right? And so all the money you spent acquiring them is really 18, 19, 20 months of rent on the other end. If you could add another lease, you could fundamentally change that ratio in a way that could change how operators might invest in the customer, right? And how they might think about that investment in the customer in the long-term relationship. And then, by the way, for the consumer, you could change how they think about their relationship with the property. If they're going to live with this brand for 10 years, might they act differently, right? And all of that we felt was very good for the ecosystem, both qualitatively and quantitatively. So that's just the first, sort of like overarching piece. When we looked at all that and said, okay, how do you do that? Right? Like that's a noble thing maybe, or an exciting thing, but how do you do that? It became pretty fundamental that if you were going to connect the dots, you had to go look at where the breakage really occurred. And, sort of intuitively where the breakage occurs is you ask someone to renew their lease, they say no, right? So we went and looked at the renewal moment, and we knew a few things about the renewal moment that were important. One, almost every single renter in the country goes through the renewal moment every single year. So, okay, this is an important experience. Number two, for an operator, your entire rent roll is up for grabs. You're reselling 100% of your rent revenue every single year. So it's pretty important, right? And then when we showed up with those two assumptions and said, okay, there's got to be some cool stuff here, nothing really existed. I mean, I can't tell you how many people were running this out of spreadsheets and PDFs and sliding paper under door. And you think about like how much time and money people are spending on products to get people into the front door. And if they're filling maybe 45 to 50% of the building that way, right? And you say, oh, you got 5 tools, you got 10 metrics, all this kind of stuff. At renewal, nothing. So that was like our first, like, okay, cool. There's obviously a software opportunity here. We can go build that. But very quickly, we realized that it wasn't just about building an operational workflow. It was about, first, how do you make renewals run in a way that are more valuable to the partner, increasing net operating income, things like that, which we can talk about. But then also, if 45, 50% of people are going to churn every single year, what are we doing with those people? From a renter perspective, how are you helping them deliver a service that maybe helps them find their next place. But then from the operator's perspective, how are you saying, wait a second, I might not be able to renew you in this lease, but how can I renew you as a customer, right? And that was the shift, and still is the shift that we're trying to convince people of, which is to say, okay, Innie, you've lived in this building. I know a ton about you. And you're telling me, that you have to move across the country for a new job. Well, you were a great renter. How do I stay with you?